Uh, ఆశ చూడండి వేలు కాకపోతే ఏంటిది వచ్చింది 6 వస్తున్నల్ల వచ్చింది ఇక్కడే సరే నోట్లో మళ్ళీ నీ మొహం కోసిది ఉప్పు కారం అంటున్నారు దేనిలో
ఉడుకు బాగానే ఉంటుంది అవలే కదా
చిన్న బెనిఫిట్ చిన్న ఎక్క కళ్ళు అన్నా వచ్చింది ఆకాశం వరకే నీకు కదా కదా ఉంది మ్యాచ్ మ్యాచ్ నీ కలిపండి పనికి పని నాన్న పోతే మోహన్ నాన్న వేసుకురామా పోతే మోహన్ నాన్న మేము ఇప్పుడు కన్నా వేసుకుంటామమ్మా నీకు ఎంతో ఆలోచన చేసుకుంటాం ఇదే ఫోటో ఏంటి కలర్ మై కలర్ ఏదిగా నీకు చాలా ఇష్యూ ఉంటుందా yes ఆయుష్ ఉందండి గడి
Good morning, students. This is the last concept, data warehousing and data mining, that is the cluster analysis. And in the cluster analysis, what are the algorithms you have to use in a cluster analysis? Those concepts you have to discuss in today's class. Clustering, mainly you have to represent cluster analysis divided into Good morning, students. Now in today class, this is the last concept in data warehousing, cluster analysis. Cluster analysis mainly we have to divide into groups. That is simply you can say that clusters. For example, data points are there in all over the world. Those points you have to represent it as one cluster. For example, uh, uh, near Hyderabad, what are the data points you have? Those all are you have to represent it as one cluster. Similar way, Chennai you have the main center. So that near surrounding data centers are there. Those centers are represented as one group. That is simply we call it as cluster. So that is the way you have to represent it as a cluster. How we can analyze these clusters, those clusters by using this cluster analysis. And here you have to use the different types of algorithms you have to use in cluster analysis. Those are k-means algorithm. Those algorithms you have to use it here. And here, clustering for the understanding. Clustering for understanding, simply you can say that classes conceptually. Conceptually, you can say that uh, classes conceptually meaning group of objects that can be common characteristics play an important role for the people who have to analyze the describe the world. For example, here we can say that a group of objects, total entire data you have to divide into objects in the group, that is the cluster, and this assigning particular objects to these groups. And for example, that cluster you have to belongs to which objects that you have to represent a classification. Mainly here we can discuss with that one is the clustering and then one is the classification. For example, here we can see young children can be quickly labeled the objects in photograph as buildings, vehicles, people, animals, plants who are there. In this context, understanding the data, clusters are potential classes, and cluster analysis is the study of techniques for automatically finding classes. The following examples here we can say that biology, information retrieval, climate, psychology and medicine, business. These are the different types of examples whenever you have to define in the cluster analysis. Biologist, as simply you can say that first one we have to consider the biology. See here, this is the biology. Biologists mainly have to spend the many years of creating a taxonomy of hierarchical classification. Generally, you have to call living things like kingdom, class, order, family, genus, and species. So these are biology related. All the data you have to represent it as one cluster. A discipline of mathematical taxonomy, and that could be automatically find the such classification structures. That is simply you can say that one of the cluster, and you have to classify it. Clustering has been used to find the groups of genes that have the similar functions, and that is the human beings are we have to represent it with the biology. That is the one group of genes are we have to represent it with the biology. That is the classification. And the next one is the information retrieval. Another example, this is the World Wide Web consists of billions of web pages and results and a query of search engines that can be written thousands of pages. So here, a query of a movie might return web pages grouped into categories such as reviews, trailers, stars, and theaters. Each category cluster can be broken into subcategories. That is simply call it as subclusters, producing hierarchical structure that further assist the user explanation of the query results. World Wide Web also you have to represent it as different clusters. So that again that cluster we have to divide, that is simply call it as sub clusters like movies, and you have to represent it as different types of movies are there, reviews or trailers are there, different types also there, and type of the uh, specification, type of the category also you can represent it. And the third one is the climate. This is the third example of the cluster analysis, that is the clustering of for understanding. Climate, simply you can represent it as understanding the earth climates requires the finding patterns in the atmosphere and ocean. Cluster analysis has been applied to find the patterns in the atmospheric pressure of polar regions and areas of the ocean that have the significant impact of the land climate. That is regarding to the climate. So climate related information you have to analyze with this example. That is simply you can say that clustering for understanding. Next to psychology and medicine. That is the illness of the condition of the frequently has a number of variations of cluster analysis can be used to identify the different subcategories. For example, you have to identify the different types of characteristics of a particular disease that is like related to the depression and regarding to the type of the characteristics you have to represent that appropriate viruses like COVID-19 you have to represent it with the psychology and medicine you have to represent. And cluster analysis can also be used to detect the patterns in spatial and temporal distribution of a disease. And next one is the another one is the clustering for the understanding. Last one is the business. Business is a collect the large number of amounts of information there on current and potential customers. It is used to segment the customers into the small number of groups. Additional analysis we can do with this market activities. So some of the cases, for example, medical related data nowadays, the prices will be hiked regarding to the business. That is additional analysis you can do with that hiking prices. With this is the one type of clustering for analysis. These are the examples for the clustering for analysis, clustering for understanding. And the second one is the clustering for utility. So, by utilization of the web pages or by utilization of the data, so you can represent it here. That is the clustering for the utility. Cluster analysis provides an abstraction form of the individual data objects to the clusters in which those objects are reside. Additionally, some clustering techniques characterize each cluster in terms of a cluster prototype. So here we have the different types of prototypes we have used here for the cluster analysis, studying the techniques. First one is the summarization process. Summarization process here. First one is the summarization process. In the summarization process, you have to data analysis techniques you have to use, such as regression or PCA, component analysis, space complexity, number of space complexity. We have to summarize the data by using this data analysis of the cluster. So this type of summarization is called as this type of processes techniques are possibly called it as summarization. So whereas we are using the related to the RAM, related to the space, and related to the regression, and related to the component analysis, we can do with the summarization only. So here the number of simply you can say that instead of applying an algorithm, entire data set can be applied to the reduced data set or consisting only for the cluster prototypes depending on the type of the analysis, the number of prototypes and accuracy with which the prototypes represent the data. And the second one is the compression. So compression means simply you have to compress the data by using this prototype. That is the cluster prototypes can also be used to cluster data compression In particular, a table is created that consists of the prototype for each cluster. Each prototype is assigned an integer value, that is its position in the table. Each object is represented by the index of the prototype associated with the cluster. This type of compression is generally called as vector quantization. In the vector quantization, mainly it is applied to the image or sound and video data. So vector quantization, compression, whenever you have to compress the data, generally what type of data you have to compress it? The images are compressed, sound is also compressed, and videos data is also compressed. That is simply you can say that vector quantization. So here, many of the data objects highly similar to the one another, and loss of information is acceptable, and also substantial reduction in the data size is desired. And the last one is regarding to the clustering for the utility, efficiently finding the nearest neighbors. Efficiently finding the nearest neighbors. It's simply you can say that finding the nearest neighbors can require computing the pairwise distance between the all points. So here we can represent if objects are relatively close to the prototype of their cluster, then we can use the prototypes to reduce the number of distance computations. So here two types of cluster prototypes far apart. Consequently, find an object nearest object neighbors is only necessary to compute the distance of two objects nearly clusters where the nearness of the two clusters measured by the distance between their prototype. Generally, we have the two clusters are there nearby near. Those clusters, which data point is nearest? That is, we have the clusters in all these two cluster. In these two clusters, we have the number of data points. One cluster have the number of data points. Another cluster also you have the data points. In a particular data point is nearest to the particular cluster. So actually the cluster you have to represent it in another cluster, but this data point is nearest to the another cluster. So here actually ఒక data point ఒక cluster 1 లోకి assign చేసాం, but it is the nearest to the cluster 2. So like efficient way you can say that is the finding the nearest neighbors you can find out by using these methods. That is the k-means algorithms you have to use there for this clustering for the utility. So this is regarding to the cluster analysis. Mainly we can do first one is the clustering. Generally you can represent it with the two ways. Clustering clustering for understanding, clustering for utility. So along with the examples we have to discuss it with that cluster analysis. So generally here in the cluster analysis, we have to use the different algorithms, k-means algorithm, DBSCAN algorithm. Those are all algorithms we have to use here regarding in cluster analysis. So clustering for understanding, clustering for utility. These are the two key points related to the cluster analysis. So first one, cluster analysis mainly two topics mainly we have to cover. First one is that different ways to group a set of objects into the set of clusters. So generally data points are represented as one cluster. So number of clusters you have to represent it, that is a set of clusters, and the type of clusters. So these are the mainly two topics mainly we have to concentrate on cluster analysis. First one is related to the different ways to the group a set of objects into a set of clusters, and the second one is the type of clusters. So here see cluster analysis. Cluster analysis groups the data objects based on only on information found in the data that describe the objects and their relationship. Okay. In many applications, so here here mainly you have to discuss in many applications the notation of the cluster is not well defined. Clearly it shows different parts. See here different ways of clustering the same set of points. How we can represent it, I will show the diagrams. See here, this is the different ways of clustering in the same data points. First one is related to the original point. This is the actual original points you have to represent it in the A figure, and the B figure, the entire original points you have to divide into two clusters. One cluster related to the you have to represent it as square boxes. Another cluster we have to represent it as uh, triangles. Clear? Okay. Now I want to these two clusters. I want to represent as four clusters. How we can represent? I want to represent the first cluster. Again, we have to divide into two clusters. One cluster you have to represent it as inverse of the triangle, and the second one is the plus. You have to represent it as square points. You have to represent it as divided into two types, two clusters. One cluster you have to represent inverse of the triangle, and the second one you have to represent it as plus. That is the four clusters. One cluster we have to divide into two clusters. Again, another cluster we have to divide into two clusters. That is the star and alteration of the square points. We have to represent it as these totally four clusters, four different symbols we have to represent it in these four clusters. I want to represent the six clusters. The same data, I want to represent it based on cluster analysis. You can same data points are there. Those data points you have to divide into two clusters, four clusters, six clusters. That is the n clusters also you can divide same point. That is the original points are divided into six clusters. So so see here first cluster in two clusters we have to consider. That first cluster we have to divide into three clusters, and the second cluster we have to divide into again three plus three. That is the six clusters we have to divide. This is the different ways of clustering for the same set of points. Okay. Cluster analysis is related to the other techniques for used to divide the data objects into groups. For instance, clustering can be regarded as a form of classification, and it creates the labeling of objects with the class labels. See here, classification. Generally, classification simply call it as divided into two types. One is the supervised classification, and second one is the unsupervised classification. So, supervised classification, generally you call it as new unlabeled objects are assigned to class label using a model developed from the objects with the known class labels. This is simply you can say that classification. Unsupervised classification, when the term classification used without any qualification within data mining, simply you can refers to the supervised classification. First one is the supervised, and second one is the unsupervised classifications. Generally, here these classifications we have to represent it as with the terms wise segmentation and partitioning. Sometimes used to synonyms as for clustering. These terms are mainly we have to frequently you have to use the approaches for the outside. Approaches for the outside simply segmentation and partition. For example, here you have term partitioning is often used to connection with the techniques that divides graphs into the subgraphs that are not strongly connected for to clustering. And segmentation refers to division of data into groups using simple techniques. అంటే జనరల్ గా పార్టిషనింగ్ అంటే ఒక గ్రాఫ్ తీసుకుని ఆ గ్రాఫ్ ని సబ్ గ్రాఫ్ కింద రిప్రజెంట్ చేస్తుంది. అండ్ ఆల్సో దట్ ఆర్ నాట్ స్ట్రాంగ్లీ కనెక్టెడ్. That type of clustering is called partitioning. And segmentation then to the division of data into the groups using simple techniques. Example, the image can be split into the segments based on that pixels, based on only the pixel intensity and the color. Clear? So ikkada manu segmentation lo simple technique use chesi మనం we have to divide division of data into the groups. But whereas in partitioning, we have to divide into graph as subgraphs, and those are not strongly connected. That is related the difference between the segmentation and partitioning. See here, this is the regarding to the segmentation and partitioning. And the last concept, this is related to the cluster analysis. Group of set of data objects into the set of clusters. And the next one is type of clusters. Different types of clusterings are you have to use in cluster analysis. An entire collection of clusters referred as a clustering. So generally here we have various types of clusterings we have to use: hierarchical and partitional and exclusive and overlapping, fuzzy and complete and partial. So these are the types of clusterings we have to use. First one, we have to represent it with the hierarchical and partitional. The most commonly discussed distinction among the different types of clusterings, whether a set of cluster is nested or unnested, or in more traditional terminology, we have to use hierarchical or partition. A partitional clustering, simply we call it as a division of set of data objects into non-overlapping subsets. Ante meeku ekkada overlap avvadu. That is simply you can say that partitional clustering. Each data object is exactly one subset. We simply call it as partitional clustering. Second one is hierarchical clustering. So it cluster again you have to divide into subclusters, which is a set of nested clusters that are organized as a tree. Each node is in the tree is the union of its children, and the root of the tree is the cluster containing the all objects. Tree are the singleton clusters, individual data objects. So here this is the different types of clusters. How we have to divide, shown in figures before just before previous slides. So we have shown that figures that is related to the hierarchical clustering and partitional clustering. మనకి previous గా మనం చూపించిన diagrams లో these are the diagrams. This is the 2 clusters, 4 clusters, 6 clusters. These are the partitional clustering. Okay. Hierarchical clustering, again have to represent a nested clustering in each level. 1 2 4 streaks we have to represent it as hierarchical clustering, and that is the BCD figures will shows the partitional clustering, and ABCD all 4 figures we have to represent it as hierarchical clustering. This is regarding to that partitional versus hierarchical clustering. And the next one is simply you can say that exclusive versus overlapping versus fuzzy clusterings. So in these clusterings mainly exclusive means that is the first one. First diagram shows the exclusive clustering. they assign each object to the single cluster. That is simply called as exclusive cluster. And the second one is overlapping or non-exclusive clustering. It is used to reflect the fact that an object is simultaneously belong to more than one group. So here a non-exclusive clustering, you can say that between an object is between two or more clusters could reasonably be assigned to any of these clusters. Equally, simply all the just two clusters, that is the 8.1, that is the second image we have to represent it as non-exclusive. And the last one is the Fuzzy clustering. Every object belongs to every cluster with the membership with the weight that is between 0 to 1, 0 and 1. Absolutely or absolutely belongs, absolutely does not belong. That is, you simply call it as Fuzzy clustering. So this is regarding to this clusterings. And the last one is complete versus partial clustering. So here complete versus partial clustering. A complete clustering assigns the way every object to cluster, whereas complete clustering and every object into the cluster. Partial clustering is does not. Simply you can say that. And a object అయితే particular clustering assign చేస్తున్నాము, that is the complete clustering. A particular object could not be assigned to a particular cluster. That is simply called it as partial clustering. So this is that regarding to the different types of clusterings. In next class, we'll continue the different types of clusters. So once you have to complete the different types of clusters, then we'll start the algorithms. That is the clustering algorithms. That is the K-means and DBSCAN algorithms. We will discuss in next classes. Okay. Thank you. So everyone must submit the assignment within. So most of the people, they have to submit it, but a few people do not submit the assignments. I noted those numbers. I will post those numbers today. Please verify who are not submitted. Thank you.